So round one is done and dusted in the 2023 Rugby Championship, and in this video I'm going to analyse in more detail the strengths between the New Zealand All Blacks and the South African Springboks. It was a really interesting weekend for rugby fans across the world, and we had two good games and two very interesting games with two very interesting outcomes. So in this video I wanted to talk about the strengths and the potential weaknesses of the All Blacks and the South African Springboks. But first, if you're joining me for the first time and you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, if you like my video content, please give me a sub. And don't forget, love your comments and feedback on the videos, as well as giving your opinions. So let me know what you're thinking about the Rugby Championship as we go forward. I'm going to be here covering all the Rugby Championship games as well as all the World Cup games. So you're going to get a full dose of rugby on this channel if that's your thing. Okay, let's get into the first game of the weekend between the Springboks and the Wallabies. And it was a much anticipated affair because in Australia in particular, there was a lot of hype around Eddie Jones coming back in as the coach of the Wallabies for his second tenure in that position. And I think if you watched and listened to all the press in Australia as the build-up of this game, you really got this impression that Jones was going to be bringing a magic bullet. But the fact remained that a lot of these players in the Australian Test team are unseasoned, and some of them are coming back with a few question marks on them, I would say that much. Then there was the other factor, and the other factor for me was going all the way to Pretoria, playing at altitude. A lot of those players hadn't had that experience before. Those that had played there know how difficult it is. And I was always concerned about how Australia, as far as a stamina and endurance point of view, plus playing against the intense crowd support and the Springboks at home. Put all those factors together and you had a very difficult challenge for the Wallabies to come over this weekend. And so it was too much for the Wallabies, but the important factor here was the performance of the Springboks. Now, we all know that the Springboks sent a lot of their team to New Zealand in preparation for the test match coming up this weekend in Auckland between the Springboks and the All Blacks. So it was a case of whether or not this was a South African B team coming out to play against the Wallabies, or whether there were some real contenders. And I think Naineba wanted to really look at some of these players in this team this weekend to see who was going to be putting their hand up, really, for an opportunity to go through this Rugby Championship and consolidate their potential position into the Springboks team heading into the World Cup. As we saw throughout the game, the Springboks started pretty much right from the get-go, putting a lot of pressure on the Australian Wallabies. And it was always going to be the case that the Australian forwards needed to step up against the Springboks if they were going to have any chance. The Wallabies' backs weren't going to get enough ball to do any damage if the tight five weren't able to win that ball, and the flankers being able to get enough ball from the breakdown as well. And that's exactly what happened. South Africa were dominant in keeping possession and also gaining possession, whether it be from set pieces or their fantastic clear-out speed at the mauls and breakdown. So I was very, very impressed with that. As the game went on, the Springboks did not take their foot off the gas. In fact, it wasn't until the last minute of the match where Australia were, I would say, quite fortunate to get a spontaneous try and make the scoreboard look a little bit better, in fact. There's no two ways of looking at it. A 43-12 thrashing is exactly what it was. But the thing about this game for me was the Springboks' dominance across the park. It didn't matter what they were doing, they were very good at it. And it really sets up a great match in Auckland this coming weekend. So let's have a little bit closer look at the teams that played in the Springboks and Wallabies game. And I just want to talk specifically about a couple of players that might have been under the spotlight or been looked at a little bit clearer, and let's see what their potential is going into this weekend's game. So starting off with South Africa, and if we have a look in their backs to start off with, I think Willie Leroux had a really strong game. He wasn't really in the game a lot, but when he was, he did all the right things, and he made a good strategic kicks. He had one flop, I think, but everybody can be forgiven for that. So he had a good game. Not going to go through all the players. I just think Moody was solid. He had some good breaks. Probably out of all the backs in South Africa didn't really get into the game, but he was good defensively. Esterhausen was very good. He got some really strong breaks, taking the ball up, but importantly clearing it out and enabling his breakdown forwards to come in and clear the ball quickly. Ardency, of course, scored a hat-trick. Fantastic game from him. He's a real weapon that the South Africans have on the wing, and he played extremely well. Manny Lebok, for me, was a really solid number 10, put on a fantastic performance, and Naiba now has a really good backup to Pollard if Pollard has continuing injury doubts. But Lebok was really, really solid. I think his game management was really good in the weekend, and his kicking was also good. Played really, really well in getting his players off and running. Reineck at halfback played a solid game. Vermeulen was fantastic. I think he's a fantastic player, Dwayne Vermeulen, and he was all over the park, solid, strong, big hit-ups. Steph du Toit had a good game, scored a try, of course, and was all over the park as well. And the rest of the forwards for South Africa were just really, really dominant. Their scrum was really good. Their line-out was set. And even when the reserves came on, I think South Africa really had a lot of dominance still in the game. So that's one thing I'm going to be touching on in my analysis today, is the difference between the two halves of play in both matches. So how did the All Blacks fare when their reserves came on versus how South Africa did? And in this particular analysis on the Wallaby and Springbok game, I think the bench that came on for the Springboks was equally strong. They didn't fall off that cliff. They kept the momentum and pressure on the Wallabies, and basically it was a great 80-minute performance from the South Africans. Now let's have a look at the Australian team and some notables in that. I think the Australian performance was lacking pretty much across the park when it came to energy and also ability to win the ball. And I think that's going to be a big problem for them in this series and across the World Cup as well. Other than Corabetti in the backs, I didn't really see anybody standing out. I think Corabetti was excellent once again. I really like this guy and the way that he plays rugby. He brings a lot of energy, power and size to the game. He goes looking for the ball, and that's what he did on Saturday. He really went chasing the ball for Australia, and he also scored a brilliant try. So Marika Corabetti for me is one of the standouts for the Australians from the weekend. Quade Cooper didn't really do a lot. Nick White was solid without being fantastic at halfback. And in the forwards, I think there was only a couple of standouts for me from Australia's point of view. Michael Hooper had a really good game, as he always does. And his namesake, Tom Hooper, until he went off at halftime, he had a really good game as well. And I'm excited by this young guy, Tom Hooper. I think he's a brilliant number 6. And I think he's going to add a lot of potential. So, yeah, across the whole Australian team, Richie Arnold came on in the second half and played well off the bench, I thought. But again, they were lacking that power and ability to win the ball from the South Africans. And I think this is going to be a big problem for Australia as they move forward. So Eddie Jones has got a lot of work to do in this week heading up to the Argentine game in Sydney. And I think he's going to be scratching his head. It obviously got to him after this game because he was quite short with some of the press in the conference afterwards. After the game, he snapped at a few of them. And I think this game really, really hurt Eddie Jones because it was a thrashing from the Springboks. And I think he's got to get his team collectively together, because I think it would have been a long plane ride back to Australia for the Wallabies and a lot of soul searching going on with a number of new guys coming into this team. I think they had a thought they were really going to give the Springboks a tough game. And I think they'd mentally prepared for being a close match. So I think by having a defeat that heavily is really going to have a big impact on it. And it's going to be interesting to see whether they can pick it up against Argentina next weekend. So there you go. There's my wrap on the Springboks versus Australia. A very dominant game from the Springboks, but importantly, it was a game that they kept the pressure on for 80 minutes. And I think that was the big difference in the weekend. Okay, let's talk about the other game that took place in Mendoza in Argentina. It's great to see a fantastic crowd turn out to welcome the All Blacks into Argentina for the weekend, and it was going to be a really interesting counter. Now, as the New Zealand press has already picked up since the game has taken place, a lot of self-celebration going on and everybody very happy with the win across there in Argentina. But in my analysis, I think we need to look a little bit deeper into this game because I can see a big difference between the All Blacks and South Africa. For me, it was a game distinctively of two different halves of rugby. The first half, the All Blacks were absolutely dominant and set up a very strong win by getting 31 points to 0 by half-time. So the All Blacks were already on a roll, and I think their power in the first half, their clearances, their decision-making, their spontaneous play, as well as their execution of scoring tries was outstanding. I think they did a really, really good point. But as I made reference to in my other video, during the halftime, I'm sure Michael Cheika had a lot of things to say to the Pumas, and they came out a different team, I felt, in the second half. So did the All Blacks. And I think this is really where my analysis from the weekend really takes hold, because we've got to look at what happened in the second half of this game. First of all, the All Blacks lost the second half, 12 points to 10. Argentina came back and started to win more ball and put the All Blacks under distinct pressure in different sets and aspects of the play. But the big notable difference for me between the Springboks and the All Blacks this weekend was the benches. The All Blacks bench, once they were empty onto the field, we saw a different style of rugby. We saw them being more conservative, and we also saw the Argentinians being more decisive and overpowering those All Blacks that were on the field. So this is a big concern for me, I think, going forward. I think the ability the Springboks had to be strong for the entire 80 minutes was very different to what the All Blacks showed us in the second part of that game. Now, a lot of people in New Zealand are saying, yeah, okay, that's fine. The game was over at halftime and all the rest of it. That's fine, but we've got to look at the World Cup that's coming up. It's going to be an 80-minute game in every single game. And if you can't put your opponents away in the first and second half, then you're going to leave yourself open for a defeat. And there's a lot of quality in the Rugby World Cup this year, and the All Blacks cannot afford to go out there and only play for 40 minutes. Now, I'm not saying they played terribly in the second half. I just think that their bench has a few question marks over it. So let's have a look at the New Zealand team that played in the weekend, and I'll just give my thoughts and analysis on some of those. So looking through the team, and I thought Beauden Barrett had a pretty good game at fullback. He and McKenzie and Mo'unga, when he came on, sorted out their interaction and their byplay. I think that worked really well. Narawa scored a try. It was his debut match for the All Blacks. I think he had a really strong game. Probably needs to be injected into the game a little bit more, go looking for the ball. Do a little bit like Corabetti does for the Wallabies, hunting the ball down and getting involved in the play. But I thought that the guy had a really good and solid game for his first game for the All Blacks. Rieko Ioane had a great game. He's very decisive at centre, outside centre. He can do line breaks very well. He scored a good try. Solid game from Ioane, and I don't think there needs to be any changes there. Jordie Barrett had a great game as well. I think that he makes some very good decisive runs, hits the ball up hard as well, and he's also providing good clearance for the ball for the clearance players to come in and get the ball out, and that's something I like a lot about Jordie Barrett. Caleb Clark on the other wing, always in my mind a guy that we've got a question mark over. We have got a couple of other wingers that are waiting to come in potentially. I don't know whether the selectors are going to stay with Clark. He's a strong, powerful guy, but I don't think he has the pace and the sleight of foot that some of the other wingers in this competition have. And I think the game's moved on now from the Jonah Lomu style to the outright speed merchants who can break through a defence and run away. Of course, Lomu used to do everything, but in this case, I think the All Blacks might be better looking for that Mark Telea or Will Jordan or somebody coming in that kind of position. Damian McKenzie, this was a big question mark for a lot of people. The selection, for whatever reason, seemed to be a little bit suspicious when he came into the team. But I think looking back at the game now, I've watched the game twice. My first comments about Damian McKenzie was I didn't think he had such a good game. I've got to pull that back a little bit and say, yeah, he had a solid game. But again, I think there's some things there that need to be worked out. Now, that may be a combination thing, getting him in there at 10, giving him more opportunities to play. It's going to be very interesting to see whether Foster starts Damien McKenzie next weekend in Auckland. What do you think? Do you think D-Mac's going to get a run on for the next match? But hard to say for me. Overall, he's got to clean up his kicking as well. Again, in tight games, that's going to matter. In this game, it wasn't such a big case, but we've got to be on the ball all the time now with every one of these games. We can't afford to take our pedal off the metal, so we need to make sure that these kicks and the percentages of kicks is going to be higher. Thought Aaron Smith had a good game, solid, scored a try, looking for opportunities. Yeah, I like Aaron Smith. He's a good, solid player, and I think he's going to be our number one pick at halfback. Adi Savia, what do you say about the guy? He always turns up, had a strong game again, big in defence, and also big taking the ball up. He's not the biggest guy on the field compared to some of the other teams, but Savia always puts in the 80 minutes that he's on the field. Sam Cane, great game as captain. And saw a lot from Sam Cane this weekend, even tripping up a pitch invader at the end of the game. But I thought that he had a really solid game. There might have been a few question marks over Cane, but I think he answered those. And he led the pack around the field really, really well. Shannon Frizzell, great game, was really industrious around the breakdown. High energy he brings to the game. He was good in the line out as well. And until he was subbed off, I thought Frizzell had a really good game. Another one of those positions and players that's going to be under the microscope for next weekend. It's going to be really interesting to see what Foster and crew do with the selection for the team against the Springboks. So yeah, looking at the rest of the team, the front row was strong. I think Dane Coles had a good game. There's been a few question marks over his fitness and his ability in this team, but he was solid. Lomax and De Groot were big up front, and they really set up a great set piece play, and the scrums were good and tight as well. So I think everybody will be happy with the way they played. And for me, the big question mark now comes over the locking position. As we know, Brodie Retallick and Sam Whitelock had a weekend off back in New Zealand, and they're always deemed to be our number 1 and 2 locks for the All Blacks. However, I think Ian Foster has a big decision to make here. We've got Whitelock coming back from a fairly serious, from what I've heard, tendon injury, and he played, of course, in the Super Rugby final. However, this could be an opportunity where I think Scott Barrett might get a run on with Brodie Retallick next week. And I'm just throwing this out there. I'm really interested to see what other people think about this. Scott Barrett is immense in there, and he's obviously the heir apparent when it comes to Whitelock and Brodie Retallick. But I think Scott Barrett in there, giving Whitelock another week off, might be a really smart thing to do for Ian Jones and the guys. They don't want to be risking Sam Whitelock at this stage of the competition. And with Barrett playing at such a high performance, he's good all around the park, Scott Barrett. He gives you intensity, he gives you height and power, and he makes some really, really good breaks up. So that might be an idea that goes through Foster and team's mind this week. They think in this competition, particularly against the Springboks, you can't afford to put out a team that hasn't got 100% fitness, ready, capable, willing to go, because they're going to get caught out at some stage. So, yeah, I think that might be one of the selection dilemmas the All Blacks are facing for this week against the Springboks. Of course, we don't know at this stage if Will Jordan's going to be coming back in. Got a knock to the head. He's been having a few headaches, etc. So, again, it may be another opportunity where he's not played. So, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I think it's off the bench the All Blacks really need to have a look at. Cody Taia, Tuangafasi, Lalo. We had Dalton Papaihi coming in. These guys were good without being brilliant, and I think there's a question mark over that strength of the New Zealand bench. And I'm saying this in comparison to South Africa's, right? Because they're obviously, for me at the moment, they're the benchmark of this competition after round number 1. So going to be really interesting to see the selections for the All Blacks this coming week. Is Richie Mo'unga going to come back in and start at number 10? That's going to be one of the decisions they're going to make. And we're going to keep Beauden Barrett at fullback, or is Damien McKenzie going to go back there and bring Barrett in off the bench? So really, my analysis this week is really around the Springboks playing an 80-minute game of rugby with high intensity, high skill level and big power. The All Blacks falling off in the second half, losing that 12 points to 10 to Argentina. Argentina did step up their game, but when the All Blacks emptied their bench, I had some concerns around that. So let me know what you think about this weekend's matches. Let's take a look at the ladder after round 1 of the Rugby Championship 22, and we see South Africa in the lead from New Zealand, followed by Argentina and Australia in 4th. So this weekend's games are going to be really critical for all teams. It's going to be very exciting, of course, with the clash of the 2 top teams in New Zealand, Auckland on Saturday, the All Blacks against the Springboks. And then we've got Australia, the Wallabies, playing the Argentinian Los Pumas in Sydney in Australia. I'm going to be back later on in the week to do a preview of both of those games, going into more detail, having a look at the team selections, and just talking about a little bit more about what I think is going to happen in those particular games. So again, thanks very much for watching. To all my friends in South Africa, thank you very much for teaching me my Afrikaans. I pronounced Loftus Versfeld the wrong way, and I got one of my great listeners to educate me on that one. So maybe before this series ends, my Afrikaans will improve dramatically, and I might be able to teach you lot a little bit of Maori as well. So there we go. Thanks very much for watching my video. I'll be back later in the week with some previews of the games for the weekend. Until then, stay safe everybody, enjoy your rugby, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button, support me if you can, and I'll see you again soon here on Inside Sport.